So the overall points I'll talk about are historical examples of activism working, my own personal story about how it was so important for me, what I think is the most important part of climate activism. There are lots of different kinds of activism, the different roles you can have within it, and any kind of final tips and takeaways. So that's the broad structure. First thing is, we can be perceived sometimes as going to the power, the establishment, and saying, please sir, can we have a more equitable society? This doesn't work. You can't go up to the power structures and say, we want more equality or have more equitable society. It doesn't work that way. What does work though is rattling the system enough to make the changes that people like Possible and Flight Free UK and all the other campaigns who are taking a much softer approach, their policies can be pushed forward through breaking the establishment as it is. First historical example of this in action is with national parks. And there were lots of these signs. You still see them everywhere now, but there were many more of them where there's no public right of way. And in 1932, a place called Kinder Scout had a mass protest, mass trespass. Lots and lots of people went to Kinder Scout because they weren't allowed to. And they were going there to say, no, we want our right of way here. There was lots of press about it. The storming of Kinder, mass trespass arrests, and so on. That massive campaign led to getting into the news, which created the public conversation about that. And now we have a plaque to commemorate their achievements, which was that mass trespass created the groundwork for what we now have as national parks. There is still more work to do though. You know, we have national parks, that's not the end of the story. We had on the 9th of April this report come out to say that the full potential of woodland cover in national parks is 35%, but from 2015 to 2020, it went from 15.2 to 15.3%. There's a big problem there in tree cover in national parks. Also, only 6% of the national parks are currently healthy. We've had a lot of sewage, which everyone knows about, but maybe not so much in terms of the national park context, which has meant that a lot of the rivers are polluted. So only 15% of lake and 39% of river water bodies in English national parks are good in condition. The Yorkshire Dales has less tree cover than the city of York because of the sheep. And what is left to do? Well, there's still campaigns going on. The Right to Roam campaign is the extension of that mass trespass that has a plaque to commemorate how well and successful they were. This is not just about congratulating historical actions. This is about supporting current ones as well. Second example, Dutch cycling. We all know that in the Netherlands, there's huge infrastructure for cycling. But it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of protest. So in the 1960s, the Netherlands was choked with cars. In 1971, 400 children were killed by car drivers. A campaign started, Stop Children's Death. And that led to huge protests where cyclists took their bicycles and laid down in the main streets. Now that led to huge changes in the dialogue, in the press, and overall in policy. Before the protest, it was just like we see in London today. After the protest, it's something which we can only dream of in London. We can see the cycle lane infrastructure comparison between Europe and the UK, and it's astonishing, isn't it? The difference. The third example I'm showing is about the women's vote. And before I go into this, I just want to explain this kind of misquoted Gandhi quote thing. Came from actually someone called Nicholas Klein, trade unionist in clothing in the US in 1918. First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they attack you and want to burn you, and then they build monuments to you. Now this is interesting because it seems to be a kind of guidebook for successful activism. It's almost as though you have to go through these stages to make it work. Now that's really important for any activist campaign to be aware of before doing it. Because when you get attacked, when you get ridiculed and get ignored, that's progress. First they ignore you. On the left we have the suffragette example, and on the right is current examples in terms of climate. So on the left we have loads of petitions that went out there. In 1896, a petition contained 250,000 signatures to get the women's vote, which was ignored. On the right we have nearly 500,000 signatories on declaring a climate emergency on Australia, which they still haven't done. Petitions don't work very well, even when you get huge numbers of signatories. But it does need to be done. To say that it doesn't work isn't really what I'm saying. It's a part of what works, even though as a direct consequence it looks like it doesn't. That's the first line at first. First they ignore you. That's the critical part of this step. The second step, well, people get enraged by that. This is the same painting. There's a suffragette took a knife to the painting, and more recently Just Stop Oil took hammers to it. The next step, then they ridicule you. We've seen all of this before in terms of the suffragette movement. You can see some pretty abhorrent messaging that came out in the media at the time. A woman's place is in her home. What I would do to the suffragettes is to stop her talking. And more recently we've seen Jeremy Clarkson describing climate protesters as smelly, bearded people in Crocs. This is just ridicule. But it's a mark of success, because it means that we're getting through that process. But then they attack you and want to burn you. The suffragettes suffered these kinds of headlines. When they were in prison, they were on a hunger strike, and they were force-fed through the nose with a tube. Now we can see people getting put in prison for just standing on the street with a sign. Will anyone stop these eco-clowns is the classic Daily Mail term, but it's exactly the same kind of rhetoric. Nothing's changed. It's the same old crap, but it is what is necessary for progress. We've also seen historical examples where suffragettes have been told that they're militant and that they are risking mayhem, and exactly the same Suella Braverman saying exactly the same message with a different group to attack. But then they build monuments after you've won. Right? So in this case, the suffragettes have had monuments all over the country, plaques, but that's not what it's about. The goal isn't to get monuments, the goal is to get change. But then it's commemorated in that way because people respect it so much. And we've seen the great-granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, the famous suffragette, saying, "I've absolutely no doubt that in 100 years' time, climate activists will be seen as the real heroes." So that's the progress. They're the necessary steps for this kind of thing to happen. The next part is to talk about activism in my life, how it actually saved it. So I was quite depressed when I first learnt about the crisis in 2020. I was quite alone. Everyone that I was around was trying to shake me up a bit and say, don't worry about it, everything's going to be okay. Or have you tried taking walks in nature? Have you tried doing this? Maybe we can fix you in some way. That was very unhelpful, and I don't blame the people for doing that. It's just the way that they were trying to help. What would have helped more is if they said, join an activist group. Because joining an activist group when you're feeling in that kind of situation gives you the community, gives you the strength to carry on, gives you ideas, makes it feel like you've got a meaning in life to get out of bed in the morning. Now, when I joined these activist groups, I got in a lot of trouble with the police, of course, because I realised that very quickly that what we need is change very, very quickly. And to do that was through non-violent direct action. So I went to the government building BEIS at the time, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, to protest at their expansion of oil and gas licenses. I was arrested that day, and it took us about a year to get through the legal system to be found not guilty of criminal damage. So I was held up for criminal damage for spraying chalk on a window for £2,000 for criminal damage. That might seem like a joke. But when that's your life, and you've got to raise thousands of pounds to defend yourself against that claim, it could be very, very difficult. That means that people who have a certain privilege in life are more able to do this kind of activism. For people who don't have a visa or a passport, they shouldn't do this. But how do they get involved in activism? It cannot be only for the privileged few. And I would argue that the people who have that privilege should be doing this. But I would argue that the people who don't have that privilege should not be doing this, but doing it on their behalf. So I also went onto the right-wing press because it's very, very important, I think, to get into those spaces because they only hear half of it, half the story, and it's often the fossil fuel industry half they hear. To talk not just about why we need to change a lot of the systems, but the effect that it has on your mental health. So I went on to Laurence Fox's show to talk about something unrelated. It could have been wood burning, it could have been ULEZ, I don't remember. But I said, I've been struggling with my mental health. And guess what? Laurence Fox struggles with his mental health too. He bonded with me over that after the camera stopped. He said, right, we'll get you back to talk about that. I got back on the show, about 15 minutes he wanted me on there to talk about it. Before the camera started rolling, I said, I'm surprised you wanted me here to talk about mental health because it's not really the playground of GB News. And he said, well, I think it's a very important issue. I really struggle with it myself. Cameras roll, bang, he was in character, right? So he is a really conflicted character. But to talk about things in that way, when you have a look at the comments on YouTube from GB News uploading this, all the comments of this are like, wow, you know, this guy, I really agree with everything he's saying. Suddenly, it's not about shooting down the climate activists. It's about finding common ground and really struggling with things. So let's talk now about the importance of climate activism. When we have a look at the CO2 increases, of course, this is just going absolutely out of this planet. Every time that we've tried to do something about it, it doesn't seem to make any difference. These are all of the large international agreements that have been trying to curb carbon emissions, and you can see that this is just unabated growth of carbon emissions. The colour shows the temperature and the height shows the carbon dioxide levels, and you can see that they are totally linked. There's a big difference in what our carbon pledges are versus what we're actually doing. What we need to do to have a habitable planet is follow these shaded lines, and you can see the stated policies or the pledges of the dashed lines or the solid lines which are way above it. So there's a very, very big gap between what we're pledging and what we need to do. Now, climate activism is a proactive approach rather than a reactive one. Now, politics always seems to be reactive, especially in today's climate, where we wait for things to happen, it goes in the news, suddenly big policy change happens. Post office, you can see this in loads of examples. People only do something when they have to. But we, as climate activists, need to make that have to before the disasters happen. So the only way I think of doing that is to give them the dilemma to say, are you going to arrest scientists? Are you going to arrest doctors publicly? Or are you going to make the changes and the demands that they're out there pushing for? Children suffer the consequences of the actions and policies that we're making today. Wildfires and floods, children and women suffer the worst, especially in the global south. Now, I don't think that's fair at all. And we need to, in the UK and in the West, push for those climate policies, break the system to make that happen. And I think it's our duty, globally, to do that. But we're trained in this capitalist world to think about ourselves, that as long as we're okay, then that's all that matters. But that's a broken system, and we need to change our mentality and think in a much more global citizen way. Let's talk about the impact of climate activism on the public dialogue. The same week that we saw the pink boat in London, saw the most important issues facing the country jump by 10%. Now, if that's not an advert for effective activism, I don't know what is. What was interesting, though, is that we didn't see these jumps continuing with the greater amplified protests that we saw in the years following. That may be because that 10% represents those who were able to make that change, that jump in that being the most important thing to them. Many other people who realized that climate was a really big problem, maybe climate still wasn't their biggest concern, but instead buying food, you know? Maybe that was still their major concern, even though these protests really alerted them to the fact that something was wrong. So we have to be able to be active on the streets on behalf of so many others who can't be there. Now, what about the roles within activism itself? Activism isn't just standing on the street with a sign. Activism is not just gluing yourself to a road, however much I think that's very important. I've got an illustration here of the hidden majority in successful campaigns, and I don't really like the hierarchy structure of this because this isn't about the top of the iceberg being the most important. That's not what I'm saying here. What I am saying is that there's a large amount of the activist community who support that direct action, who support the people who are on the streets and support those who get in the media. These are the people who, as I mentioned before, may not be able to risk arrest because of their job, because of their passport or visas or student status and so on. But if you're in that situation, in a vulnerable place, that doesn't mean that you can't be involved in activism. It just means that you're involved in the more hidden part, which is to support the actions through social media. It's photographing the events. It could be the artwork that goes around the campaigns, or police station support to be there for the people who come out of prison or a cell, totally disoriented and maybe haven't eaten. Through donations, if you're wealthy enough to do that. Influential contacts, if you happen to know some of the people who are influential. Part of activism is to talk to them in a difficult way. Maybe it's even to provide a bedroom for someone who's come from a different city to London. Maybe it could be bringing food to a protest that you've made. But whatever it is, it's using a skill that you have. But it could also be develop a skill that would help the movement. For a successful campaign, I believe, and many others believe that they need to be SMART. Now, we may have heard this before, but it's the SMART stand for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-specific. Now, Insulate Britain, I think, was a very successful campaign. It was specific because it was about insulating Britain. It was measurable because you could see the influence of people talking about insulation. It was achievable because many people could get insulation put into their homes. And we've seen that in historical cases, before the green crap was cut, right, we saw a huge amount of cavity wall and loft insulation in homes. So this is achievable because it has been done in the past. It's realistic because it's been done in the past. And it was time specific because they only did it for a number of months because they realized that burnout was a big problem. So they kept it time specific as well. We saw on Google, the word insulate popped up massively during their campaign, but I want to hone down a little bit more onto what is sustainable activism. So even though people might want to get involved in activism either on the front lines or in the hidden majority, wherever you are in this structure of supporting the activist campaign, there's a real danger here of burnout. Now, I may be speaking to people in the room who are involved in activism directly already, and I would, in this case, want to talk to you specifically about what burnout can look like. So if you're involved in an activist campaign, you may feel a heightened sense of responsibility. Maybe people in your social circle or your work are not really taking this seriously, and you feel that it's your duty to act on their behalf. You know, they're not acting, so you need to. There's a kind of heightened sense of responsibility in many activists' minds in that way. If you do all you can do, you won't sleep or eat. And that can happen because you feel that you can always do more. So it's very important to stay out of that overworking mentality. There's so much to do and so little time to do it. That's often what people think. And this going into an activist campaign is, in most cases, a marathon rather than a sprint, although I'd argue that Insulate Britain was a sprint. But the overall climate campaign has to be a marathon for us to keep it going. And some of us can think about making it up for all the people who aren't doing anything. So this is a real danger for people going into the activist world, that sense of responsibility can become dominating. If that is to happen, just recognizing the signs that it's happening, talking to other people in the activist community about your feelings in this way, make it normalized so that other activists don't feel that they need to fall into these traps as well. So it's a real community, and it's really breaking away from the capitalist mentality where everyone has to do everything on their own. Activism is community, and it saves lives. So by being in an activist community and talking about these things, including burnout, I think is really important. To focus on the big things and less on the small, very important as well, I think. And to know that many others are doing loads of things that you may not even know about. Maybe you're driven by how little media coverage there is, but how much is happening that isn't in the media? If you've been involved in a campaign and that hasn't been in the news, you know there's loads of stuff that goes on that is never covered and you won't know about. And it's knowing in the background that lots of these campaigns are happening is very important as well, I think. And sometimes in these activist circles, you can say no. And by setting an example, by saying, no, I can't do that, I'm too busy. It's really important. And it can be undervalued, especially of people who are just joining activist campaigns. You want to do everything. But if you do that, it's a fast track to burnout. So that's just something to be aware of if you're getting into it now. And always talk to people who get it. Right? If you're going to a barbecue and you just changed your diet, it could be very difficult. So going into these kinds of spaces, just be aware that if you're feeling vulnerable, don't do it, or go with someone who gets it. So you can talk to them behind the scenes and go, I'm really struggling here, rather than just trying to put on a brave face all the time. It can be very difficult. So the last slide, final takeaways. What can we do about it? Well, I would encourage anyone here who's involved in an activist campaign to think very hard and deeply about that burnout, and just make sure that you're doing those things to avoid it. If you're not in an activist movement yet, then think about which campaigns you may want to consider supporting. Is it a way that you can support by being on the front lines? Is it something you can support through social media, or any of those other, many other hidden ways of supporting activist groups? Now, how do you get involved in them? You talk to people. There are many people in this festival now who are going to be a part of activist groups, and maybe you want to talk to people in some of the stands and say, how can I help? Being in a position where you can support them, however much or little that you can, helps you as much as it helps them. Also in these kinds of places, this is the first time that EarthFest has run, and they've made some mistakes. They've got support by Auto Trader, and we've just had a talk about car-free cities. They've had a list of attendees, including JP Morgan, the biggest supporter of fossil fuels in the world, Drax, who burn trees, oil and gas companies, Total Energies, and so on. So they've been listed on EarthFest website, attendees list, and that was a massive error. But I spoke to them yesterday about it, and they were happy enough to take that down. So yesterday they took that list down. That was activism on my part, because I went to speak to them. I found out about it, I spoke to them, and they took it down. Now, I'd say that that's important and successful, but even if they didn't take it down, that's still successful, because I've told them about it and they probably won't do it next time. Those metrics of success can be a bit difficult to understand sometimes, but just doing things with other people, especially if you can, is the metric of success in my book about activism. So I might stop there. I think that's the end. How long have I got? 10 minutes, great. So 10 minutes now for any questions. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. With Russia, Navalny was for those of you who don't know, I'm sure many of you do, but he was an activist, a political activist in Russia to try to dethrone Putin. He had some troubling views in terms of immigration and so on. He wasn't perfect, but he did do a lot of good things. Now, he went through a campaign to try to create a movement in Russia away from Putin. Now, that can put people in prison and get people killed. He was outside the country to try to avoid arrest, but then realized he was ineffective because he couldn't affect change outside the country. So he went back in knowing he would be imprisoned and killed. Now that is pretty out there, right? For someone to do that. But in a desperate situation, as it is in Russia, calls for desperate measures. I believe people in the UK would do the same thing if we were in that same situation. And I don't think it's necessarily far away for us to be in a totalitarian state in the UK. I can see that a slippery slope to fascism is emerging. But that doesn't mean that activism has to stop. It's in positions of desperation that the stakes are very high, and those people getting involved in activism are putting their lives on the line. We've seen this in many other countries around the world in terms of climate activism as well. People in South America putting themselves on the line and getting killed doing that too. We are in a very privileged position in the UK to be able to do these things without being beheaded. But I would argue for that perspective, we have to fight on behalf of many other countries who cannot. So I would say that campaigning against fossil fuels is supporting Navalny indirectly, because Russia's funds come from fossil fuels, and we're cutting that out by getting rid of fossil fuels. So it's in indirect support of that campaign, and for the many brave people in Russia who are doing this, I salute them. And I think that the climate activist campaigns and anti-capitalist campaigns in the UK are supporting them. I would just want people in the UK to realise that, and it can be a bit difficult. You asked again another question about, there was another, can you remind me? Sorry. Yeah, so in Russia, where the people there have been oppressed for so many decades, through Stalin. I mean, I'm an aerosol scientist. I just wrote my thesis last week, and I wrote a chapter there about how the scientists during Stalin's reign of terror were imprisoned and separated from their families, and that delayed the progress of aerosol science by 10 years. So Russia's had a big history of suppressing progress in many ways, not just in human rights, but in science as well. And people are still fighting it. So there's, even when people are kicked to the ground, it can act as a motivator. It just means that the stakes are higher. And those who are doing activism, on direct activism in Russia, as I said before, are one of the bravest people I can think of. But it's not confined to Russia. Of course, there are many other countries around the world. I used to live in China. Tiananmen Square is there's a famous photo of someone standing in front of the tanks who were coming in to calm the protests that were happening in Tiananmen Square with the students. Many students were shot by the government, killed. Nobody in China knows about it. I was shocked when I was walking around there with local people talking about, well, it's crazy that we're walking around this Tiananmen Square so peaceful when, in the 80s people were killed here. And they said, what? People were killed here? Yeah, don't you know? They have such a control of the media narrative, the public narrative, that very few people know about that. And it can be very worrying when media has so much, is being manipulated so much by vested interests. We may not realise that in the UK, but our media is controlled by the billionaire press, billionaires, right? So the 4 billionaires who control most of the media. We believe in the UK that we have a free press. This is not true. And very few people are aware of that. And how much of the public narrative is manipulated by those billionaires is frightening. So we're not that far away from that kind of state-controlled, not state-controlled, billionaire-controlled media, and in many cases it's state-controlled, but they're still billionaires. So in Russia and in China, this is very similar. Like everyone in China thinks the Uyghurs are militant, crazy people, whereas people on the outside know a very different story. People in Russia believe that, they were liberating Ukraine from fascism. How much of the media controls the public consciousness is frightening, and it's difficult for us all to be thinking about how we get the media without being manipulated ourselves when we're all either in our eco bubbles or trying to get the news from the billionaire press. It's very, very difficult to know what's happening, especially with the rise of AI with fake media as well. I don't have an answer for that, but just being aware of it, I think, is very important. Yeah. Yeah. So I've spoken with a few journalists about this, about how activist groups are squeezed to become more and more extreme and put ourselves at more and more risk to get those headlines, and we think it's very unfair. But yeah, we have to play the media game, which is incredibly frustrating. But it's a part of what needs to happen for success. If we're only considering getting reported in open democracy, for example, That's not going to be read by very many people, and the effect is going to be very small. So we do need to get active in ways that are going to be reported by these billionaire press. Now, that means that we're going to be called eco-loons and eco-fascists, fine. But that's a part of progress. It's suffering that ridicule that we expect because it's a part of the system as it is. And to treat that as success rather than a failure is very important for activist groups at this stage, however sad that is. I'm very glad you raised that point about this morning. So for those of you who weren't glued to your TV sets this morning at 9 o'clock, on BBC Two, Laura Kuenssberg gives a weekly Sunday show about politics. And this morning, Chris Packham, one of the legends of climate activism, was there, alongside a climate denier who was brought in for balance. And Chris Stark is he was the kind of the head, I guess, of the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, who independently, apolitically advises the government on their climate policies and calls them out when they don't do enough. Produce a lot of reports. He was interviewed in the Science Museum in the Energy Gallery, sponsored by Adani, the biggest coal baron in the world. Laura Kuenssberg is unfortunately a puppet of the fossil fuel industry, as far as I can see. And she was asking questions that didn't talk about the fossil fuel sponsorship of the gallery they were in, but they did put a photo of our protest and said to Chris Stark, "How do you feel about that?" His response was very disappointing. He said that he feels that climate activists are making his job harder and making it so that he can't push his agenda to wean the UK off fossil fuels. This is deeply troubling for someone in that position with that audience to be saying that kind of thing. I'm very glad that Chris Packham was on the show. He wasn't questioned because he was there as well at this protest and he wasn't asked about that. But he did say as clearly as he could the value of protest and to support the campaigns. But in a greater sense of social media, maybe not very many people watch this on TV, but many people will watch the clips taken from that show that are put on social media. The importance of that comes in the text around that image or that video. And this is where the fossil fuel industry are putting a lot of money, because they'll be thinking, we know more people look at social media than they do TV. We'll take those clips, those choice clips, and put them around social media and pay people who are impoverished through the capitalist system. We'll pay them to write messages about how eco-loons are deluded or something, right? And there's a huge amount of it on Twitter, on most social media networks, through the lens of freedom of speech. Recent moves, I think, on Instagram meant that if you're a political group, that you are muted with your reach. So if you are Scientist Rebellion, for example, then suddenly your reach has crashed because of their change in policy, that they're a political group. Am I right in that? How do we tackle that? It's very, very difficult because you're playing in a system that is controlled by billionaires. So in social media, if you're trying to get your campaign out there, you've got to play by the rules of the billionaires to make it work all the time. This is so troubling and difficult. I think many activists would be happy to jump ship, but the trouble is if you do that, you're getting off the mainstream and not reaching the big audience. This is why I do GB News, because it's the way to actually get into the ears of the misled and the failed, the people who've been failed by society. It's going out of your bubbles and going out of your comfort zone is crucial, even if social media is controlled by to some extent, the fossil fuel industry, is to keep true to your message and get out of your comfort zone and go into the spaces that are difficult. It's my way of dealing with that, but there'll be many others. I would encourage you to ask that question to other people and see what they say. Yeah, I heard the Ecotricity guy, what's his name? Dale Vince, who gave a talk yesterday and talked about how he took his money away from Just Stop Oil because he felt that the campaign was being used by the Tories in a way that was preventing action from happening out. He may have done that publicly, I'm not sure what he's doing privately. But it's important not to blame activist groups for lack of action. However supportive you are, publicly or privately, never do that. However much these campaigns can be dressed up in the media as Just Stop Oil, fascists, stop holidays goers or something, right? If you're there saying, actually, yeah, that they have a point, you know, that those people's holidays were disrupted, yeah, they did get disrupted, and that's the success. It's not about it's not about taking the attitudes of the individuals who are affected in the same sphere as the message, which is we shouldn't be flying on holiday anyway. And it's zooming out of that individual suffering of an action and looking at the bigger picture that everyone in this room has a responsibility to do whenever we hear that rhetoric. To say, okay, those individuals may have suffered, and I'm sorry that they did. But let's step back here a bit. Let's talk about why they were there. Straight away, you're out of that situation. And that's what I think that everyone has a responsibility to do, however much they support or not these actions. Because that's the way that change is made, not through petitions. It's not through playing the game as it is. The game is rigged for these to fail. So the way that the game's changed is through breaking the system, by making it very, very uncomfortable for business as usual to keep going. And that has to happen through non-violent direct action. And maybe in certain cases, some kind of violence is the way that you change the system. We're not there yet, but many other countries are. And I wouldn't say, therefore, they shouldn't do whatever they think is they need to do. But we're in really troubling times. And if people take direct action as a scapegoat for lack of action, this is a very, very worrying aspect of what I can see as I saw this morning on the BBC. So yeah, I'm not sure I'll answer that totally, but that's just my thoughts. Ready to wrap up. Thanks.